The courtroom buzzed with hushed anticipation as the judge, Eleanor Hayes, settled into her high-backed chair. The echoes of shuffling papers and muted conversations created a symphony of tension, punctuated only by the rhythmic clacking of her gavel. Her piercing gaze swept over the room, but her mind was miles away, tangled in thoughts of her long-buried past. At the center of the room, the prisoner stood motionless, his face shadowed by the dim light. The only detail breaking the monochrome of his attire was a peculiar amulet hanging from his neck, a small, tarnished object with an intricate design. Eleanor's eyes fixated on it, her heartbeat quickening in an unervingly familiar rhythm. She squinted, trying to shake off the fog of recognition that was clouding her mind. The amulet's cold metallic gleam seemed to cast a spectral light on her memories, igniting a forgotten pain. It was a connection she had tried so hard to bury, one she thought had long been buried with the memories of her mother. As the defense attorney continued with his arguments, Eleanor's vision blurred. The room seemed to contract and expand in a disorienting dance, and the murmurs of the courtroom grew distant, muffled like echoes through a tunnel. Her breathing grew shallow, and the familiar feeling of dread settled heavily in her chest. Before she could even process the shift, the world tilted violently. Her hands, once steady on the gavel, now fumbled and clutched the armrests for support. The room, previously a solid structure of order and control, seemed to dissolve around her. Faces blurred into a hazy panorama of shock and concern. The gavel fell to the floor with a resounding thud, shattering the silence. Eleanor's last coherent thought before the darkness claimed her was the sight of the amulet swinging gently as if mocking her, the very artifact that had rekindled a past she had fought to escape. The scene that followed was a chaotic scramble. Attendants and attorneys rushed to her side, their voices a mix of panic and confusion. The once formal decorum of the courtroom dissolved into a frantic blur of movement and noise. The paramedics arrived swiftly, lifting Eleanor onto a stretcher, their faces etched with concern. As she was carried out, her mind remained ensnared by the image of the amulet. The memory of her mother, the murder that had gone unsolved, and the long years of silence seemed to converge in that single, haunting object. The courtroom's oppressive atmosphere lingered, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal, and some pasts can never be outrun. The transition from the sterile environment of the hospital room to the somber shadows of Eleanor's past was as jarring as it was inevitable. The familiar scent of antiseptic and the soft hum of medical equipment were a stark contrast to the heavy silence that enveloped her once she regained consciousness. Her mind reeled, trapped between the present and a past that had suddenly burst into her reality with an unrelenting force. In the quiet of the hospital room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a turbulent sea of fragmented memories. The amulet's image burned behind her eyes, an unwelcome visitor from a time she had hoped to forget. The journey ahead was clear, yet daunting, a return to a past she had buried so deeply it felt as though it had never truly existed. As Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, she caught her reflection in the sterile glass of the hospital window. The fatigue and confusion were evident in her expression, mirroring the disarray within her. The journey to reconcile with her past had just begun, and the fainting spell was merely the first ripple in a storm that would shake the foundations of her world. The transition from this revelation to the quiet determination that would follow was seamless. Eleanor knew, with a painful clarity, that the past she had hoped to leave behind had returned, uninvited and insistent. The court's next session loomed, and with it, the weight of unresolved secrets and a story that was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with hushed anticipation as the judge, Eleanor Hayes, settled into her high-backed chair. The echoes of shuffling papers and muted conversations created a symphony of tension, punctuated only by the rhythmic clacking of her gavel. Her piercing gaze swept over the room, but her mind was miles away, tangled in thoughts of her long-buried past. At the center of the room, the prisoner stood motionless, his face shadowed by the dim light. The only detail breaking the monochrome of his attire was a peculiar amulet hanging from his neck, a small, tarnished object with an intricate design. Eleanor's eyes fixated on it, her heartbeat quickening in an unervingly familiar rhythm. She squinted, trying to shake off the fog of recognition that was clouding her mind. The amulet's cold metallic gleam seemed to cast a spectral light on her memories, igniting a forgotten pain. It was a connection she had tried so hard to bury, one she thought had long been buried with the memories of her mother. As the defense attorney continued with his arguments, Eleanor's vision blurred. The room seemed to contract and expand in a disorienting dance, and the murmurs of the courtroom grew distant, muffled like echoes through a tunnel. Her breathing grew shallow, and the familiar feeling of dread settled heavily in her chest. Before she could even process the shift, the world tilted violently. Her hands, once steady on the gavel, now fumbled and clutched the armrests for support. The room, previously a solid structure of order and control, seemed to dissolve around her. Faces blurred into a hazy panorama of shock and concern. The gavel fell to the floor with a resounding thud, shattering the silence. Eleanor's last coherent thought before the darkness claimed her was the sight of the amulet swinging gently as if mocking her, the very artifact that had rekindled a past she had fought to escape. The scene that followed was a chaotic scramble. Attendants and attorneys rushed to her side, their voices a mix of panic and confusion. The once formal decorum of the courtroom dissolved into a frantic blur of movement and noise. The paramedics arrived swiftly, lifting Eleanor onto a stretcher, their faces etched with concern. As she was carried out, her mind remained ensnared by the image of the amulet. The memory of her mother, the murder that had gone unsolved, and the long years of silence seemed to converge in that single, haunting object. The courtroom's oppressive atmosphere lingered, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal, and some pasts can never be outrun. The transition from the sterile environment of the hospital room to the somber shadows of Eleanor's past was as jarring as it was inevitable. The familiar scent of antiseptic and the soft hum of medical equipment were a stark contrast to the heavy silence that enveloped her once she regained consciousness. Her mind reeled, trapped between the present and a past that had suddenly burst into her reality with an unrelenting force. In the quiet of the hospital room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a turbulent sea of fragmented memories. The amulet's image burned behind her eyes, an unwelcome visitor from a time she had hoped to forget. The journey ahead was clear, yet daunting, a return to a past she had buried so deeply it felt as though it had never truly existed. As Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, she caught her reflection in the sterile glass of the hospital window. The fatigue and confusion were evident in her expression, mirroring the disarray within her. The journey to reconcile with her past had just begun, and the fainting spell was merely the first ripple in a storm that would shake the foundations of her world. The transition from this revelation to the quiet determination that would follow was seamless. Eleanor knew, with a painful clarity, that the past she had hoped to leave behind had returned, uninvited and insistent. The court's next session loomed, and with it, the weight of unresolved secrets and a story that was far from over. The first rays of dawn filtered through the half-drawn curtains of Eleanor Hayes' study, casting long shadows across the room. The heavy silence of the early morning was punctuated only by the soft rustling of papers as Eleanor meticulously organized the case files she had retrieved from the hospital. The amulet's photograph lay prominently on her desk, a grim reminder of the journey ahead. The room, filled with the faint aroma of brewed coffee, was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where Eleanor sought solace and clarity. Yet, today, it felt like the very walls were closing in, as if the room itself was bracing for the weight of unresolved questions that loomed over her. Eleanor sat behind her mahogany desk, her fingers brushing over the yellowed papers and faded photographs. The old case file was a relic from another era, filled with fragmented notes and evidence that had long been shelved. Each piece of paper she touched seemed to whisper secrets long buried, reigniting a fire that had never truly been extinguished. She picked up the telephone and dialed a number she had hoped never to use again. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, Detective Martin Reynolds, now retired but still a key figure in her memories. Detective Reynolds, Eleanor began, her voice steady but firm. This is Judge Hayes. I need to reopen the case of my mother's murder. There was a long pause on the other end. Eleanor could almost hear the gears turning in Reynolds' mind as he processed her request. Finally, his voice broke the silence, tinged with surprise and something else, perhaps apprehension. "Judge Hayes, that case was closed years ago. What's changed?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the photograph of the amulet. "I've seen something that makes me believe there's more to uncover. I need your help." Reynolds agreed to meet, and the arrangement was made for that afternoon. As the call ended, Eleanor felt a surge of both relief and trepidation. The decision to reopen the case was no longer a mere thought. It was a reality taking shape with every passing moment. Later that day, Eleanor met Reynolds at a small, dimly lit cafe. The contrast between the warmth of the cafe and the coldness of the case she was about to revisit was stark. Reynolds, his face weathered by years of experience, greeted her with a nod and a tired smile. "I'm not sure what you hope to find, Eleanor," Reynolds said as they took their seats. The case was thorough. Every lead was followed. Eleanor leaned in, her gaze intense. "The amulet that was found with my mother's body, it was mentioned briefly in the reports, but I saw it again recently, and it has stirred something I can't ignore." Reynolds frowned, his fingers tapping the table in thought. "That amulet, it was always a peculiar detail. We never figured out its significance." As they spoke, Eleanor noticed a shift in Reynolds' demeanor, a hint of curiosity, perhaps even hope. The detective's resistance softened as he reviewed the case with Eleanor. They pored over the old files, discussing each piece of evidence and each witness statement with renewed vigor. The cafe's cozy ambience contrasted sharply with the gravity of their conversation. The smell of fresh pastries and brewing coffee was a stark juxtaposition to the seriousness of the investigation. Each new detail unearthed felt like a piece of a larger puzzle coming into focus, drawing Eleanor and Reynolds closer to the truth. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor and Reynolds concluded their meeting with a mutual sense of determination. The case was to be reopened, not as a forgotten relic of the past, but as a living, breathing mystery that demanded resolution. As Eleanor left the cafe, the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows on the pavement. The world outside seemed different, as if acknowledging the weight of the past she was about to confront. The transition from the cafe's warmth to the cold, harsh reality of the investigation was palpable. Eleanor's resolve was unshakable, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges and discoveries. The journey had begun anew, and with it, the search for the truth that had eluded her for so long. The case of her mother's murder, once thought to be closed, was now a fresh canvas, waiting to be explored. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eleanor Hayes' office as she meticulously spread out the case files on her polished oak desk. The once familiar weight of the evidence now felt like a tangible presence, heavy with the promise of hidden truths. Her mind was a whirlwind of old wounds and new revelations, each document a piece of the puzzle she was determined to solve. Eleanor's gaze lingered on a photograph of the crime scene, a dark and somber reminder of her mother's murder. The image was a stark contrast to the vibrant life she had once known. Her mother's elegant dress, now stained with the grime of a crime that had never been fully understood, haunted her thoughts. A knock on the door broke the silence, and Reynolds stepped in, carrying a worn briefcase. He nodded in acknowledgement, and Eleanor motioned for him to sit. The detective's presence was a welcome anchor in the storm of her emotions. "Detective," Eleanor began, her voice resolute, "I've been reviewing the case files, and there are inconsistencies that we need to address." Reynolds nodded, his eyes scanning the array of documents laid out before him. "Let's see what we've got." As they worked through the files, Eleanor pointed out the discrepancies she had noticed, witness statements that contradicted each other, evidence that seemed to have been overlooked, and the amulet's mention which had been dismissed as insignificant. "There was one witness," Eleanor said, her finger tracing a line on the report, "who claimed to have seen someone leaving the scene, but their statement was never thoroughly investigated." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "We should track down that witness. If their account is accurate, it could provide new insights into the case." The detective's words carried a weight of determination, and Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. They made plans to locate the witness, an elderly woman named Margaret Thompson, whose testimony had been dismissed years ago. The promise of new information felt like a beacon in the murky waters of their investigation. The next day, Eleanor and Reynolds found themselves on the doorstep of a modest, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The garden was overgrown, and the paint on the house had long since peeled away. The contrast between the well-maintained courthouse and this neglected home was stark, mirroring the disparity between the polished facade of justice and the raw, unpolished reality of their search. Margaret Thompson answered the door with a weary smile, her eyes clouded by the passage of time. "I wasn't expecting visitors," she said, her voice a soft rasp. Eleanor introduced herself and Reynolds, and they were invited inside. The living room was filled with dusty knickknacks and faded photographs, a testament to a life lived quietly away from the limelight. As they sat across from Margaret, Eleanor felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "Ms. Thompson, we're revisiting the case of the murder of my mother. Your statement back then mentioned seeing someone leave the scene. We'd like to hear more about that." Margaret's eyes seemed to cloud over with the weight of the past. "I remember it vividly," she began, her voice trembling. "I saw a figure leaving the alley, but it was so dark, I couldn't make out their face. I told the police everything I knew, but it seemed like they weren't interested in my account." Reynolds took notes, and Eleanor listened intently. The details Margaret provided were sparse but significant. There was something in her tone, a hint of unease, that suggested there might be more to her story. As Eleanor and Reynolds left Margaret's house, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the quiet street. The transition from the intimate conversation with Margaret to the broader scope of their investigation was palpable. The new information was like a crack in the foundation of the case, revealing the potential for hidden layers beneath. Back at the office, Eleanor reviewed the new lead with renewed energy. The inconsistencies in the old case files seemed to align with Margaret's testimony, suggesting that there was indeed more to uncover. The evening shadows grew longer as Eleanor and Reynolds worked late into the night, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The hidden truth was beginning to emerge from the fog of the past, and with it, the promise of answers that had eluded them for so long. The journey was far from over, but Eleanor felt a surge of hope that the elusive truth was within reach. The city had settled into a quiet lull as dusk crept across the skyline, casting a shadow over the busy streets. Eleanor Hayes and Detective Reynolds walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly in the narrow alleyways of downtown. The sense of urgency that had driven them through the day now gave way to a palpable tension as they approached their next destination, the office of a journalist who had covered the original case. Inside the dimly lit office of James Carter, the journalist's cluttered desk was strewn with papers and old case files, a testament to years of investigative work. Carter himself sat behind the desk, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and sharp eyes that belied his seemingly disheveled appearance. "Judge Hayes, Detective Reynolds," Carter greeted them, rising from his chair with a nod. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor took the lead. "We're reopening the case of my mother's murder, and we're looking for any additional insights you might have. We've come across some discrepancies in the original reports and new leads that suggest there's more to uncover." Carter's eyes narrowed with interest. "I remember the case well. There were a lot of angles we couldn't explore fully back then. What's come up that you think might be significant?" Eleanor and Reynolds briefed Carter on the inconsistencies they had found. Margaret Thompson's overlooked witness statement, the amulet's unexpected prominence, and the inconsistencies in the evidence handling. Carter listened attentively, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "There was one thing that always struck me as odd," Carter said finally. "A few days before your mother's murder, there were some whispers about a possible suspect who was never officially linked to the case. I didn't have enough to run a story, but it seemed like a lead worth pursuing." Carter reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder marked "Confidential." He opened it to reveal a series of documents and notes, including an anonymous tip-off about a man named Robert Hale, a name Eleanor had never seen before. "This Hale character," Carter explained, "was rumored to have had a motive, but there was never any concrete evidence to tie him to the crime. Eleanor's heart raced as she scanned the notes. Robert Hale was an enigma. His name was mentioned briefly in the background of the case, but he had never been investigated thoroughly. "This is significant," Reynolds said, his voice steady. "We need to track him down and see what he knows." The trio agreed to meet the following day to pursue this new lead. As Eleanor and Reynolds left Carter's office, the cool evening air was a stark contrast to the heated discussion they had just had. The transition from the dense atmosphere of the investigation room to the quiet streets was almost symbolic, marking a shift in their pursuit of the truth. The next morning, Eleanor and Reynolds drove to a small, rundown neighborhood on the edge of town, where Robert Hale was reportedly living. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to the high-profile case that had once captivated the city. The houses were dilapidated, and the streets were littered with debris, a far cry from the polished facades of the courthouse and media offices. They arrived at a weather-beaten house at the end of the block. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Eleanor's heart pounded as they approached the front door, each step echoing the weight of their anticipation. Robert Hale answered the door, a man in his early 50s with a rugged appearance and weary eyes. His gaze was wary as he took in the sight of the judge and detective standing before him. "What do you want?" Hale's voice was gruff, his demeanor defensive. Eleanor stepped forward, her tone firm but controlled. "Mr. Hale, we're reopening the investigation into my mother's murder. We have reason to believe that you might have information that could be crucial to solving the case." Hale's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've got nothing to say." Reynolds stepped in, his presence authoritative. "We have documents linking you to the case, Mr. Hale. It's in your best interest to cooperate." Hale hesitated, the weight of their words sinking in. After a tense moment, he invited them inside. The interior of the house was cluttered, a chaotic reflection of Hale's inner turmoil. As they sat across from Hale, Eleanor's resolve was unshaken. The conversation was charged with tension, each question probing deeper into Hale's involvement, or lack thereof. Hale's responses were evasive, but there was a glimmer of something beneath his surface, a hidden truth that remained just out of reach. The confrontation with Hale left Eleanor and Reynolds with more questions than answers, but it also reinforced their commitment to unraveling the mystery. The transition from this intense interrogation to the quieter moments of reflection was palpable. As they left Hale's house, the weight of their discoveries settled heavily on their shoulders. The pursuit of the truth was far from over, but Eleanor felt a renewed sense of determination. The hidden truths they sought were becoming clearer, and with each revelation, the path to justice grew ever more tangible. The early morning mist hung heavily over the city as Eleanor Hayes drove through the quiet streets, her thoughts swirling with the implications of their latest lead. The day ahead promised crucial meetings, each with the potential to reshape their investigation. The transition from the stillness of dawn to the bustling energy of the city was marked by a deep sense of anticipation. Eleanor's first stop was the law firm where her late mother's attorney, Thomas Mitchell, had worked. Mitchell had been an old family friend, and Eleanor hoped he might shed light on any lingering questions about her mother's affairs. The firm's sleek, modern exterior contrasted sharply with the weight of Eleanor's inquiry. Inside, Eleanor was greeted by the firm's receptionist and led to a private office where Mitchell's successor, Laura Jenkins, awaited her. Laura, a composed woman in her early 40s, looked up with a mix of curiosity and professional detachment. "Judge Hayes," Laura began as they shook hands. "What brings you to us today?" Eleanor took a seat, her gaze steady. "I'm reopening the investigation into my mother's murder. I understand that Thomas Mitchell was her attorney, and I'm hoping you might have insights or documents related to her case." Laura's expression shifted to one of concern. "I'll do my best to assist you. However, I should inform you that Mitchell's files are largely archived, and there might be limited information still accessible." As Laura accessed the archives, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on the changing landscape of the case. The transition from the personal and emotional to the procedural was jarring, yet necessary. The papers Laura retrieved were filled with details about the estate, including a series of confidential letters and legal documents that had been sealed. One document in particular caught Eleanor's eye, a letter from her mother to Mitchell, expressing concerns about someone close to her. The vague nature of the letter was frustrating, but it hinted at possible internal conflicts or betrayals. Laura noticed Eleanor's reaction and said, "There's something else you might want to know. Thomas Mitchell had been involved in a few shady deals before his death, but I never thought it was connected to your mother's case." Eleanor's interest was piqued. Shady deals? What kind of deals? Laura hesitated. Mostly financial, embezzlement, that sort of thing. There were rumors, but nothing concrete ever came of it. As Eleanor left the law firm, the discovery of the letter and the mention of Mitchell's dubious activities weighed heavily on her mind. The quiet of the city streets was a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. The next meeting was with an old contact of Reynolds, a former colleague who had connections with the local underworld. In a dimly lit, smoky bar, Reynolds and Eleanor sat across from a wiry man named Victor, whose shrewd eyes darted around the room. "You're asking about Robert Hale," Victor said, his voice low and guarded. "I've heard whispers. Hale's got ties to some dangerous people. If he's involved, there's more to it than we've uncovered." Eleanor leaned in, her voice steady. "What do you know about these ties?" Victor took a sip of his drink, eyeing Eleanor with a mixture of caution and intrigue. "Hale's connections go deep: criminal networks, corruption. If he's linked to your mother's case, it's likely that someone powerful is involved." The revelation hit Eleanor like a thunderbolt. The investigation had always been about uncovering the truth, but now it was clear that it was entangled with forces far beyond her initial understanding. The transition from suspect to a potential web of corruption was daunting. As Eleanor and Reynolds left the bar, the weight of Victor's words hung over them. They were entering treacherous territory, where allies could become enemies and trust was a scarce commodity. The transition from their previous leads to this new, more dangerous phase was palpable. The next few days were filled with tense negotiations and covert meetings. Eleanor found herself navigating a landscape where every interaction was fraught with uncertainty. Friends and allies were hard to distinguish from potential threats. In a late-night conversation with Reynolds, Eleanor reflected on the shifting dynamics of their investigation. "The deeper we dig, the more complicated this case becomes. I'm beginning to wonder if we're in over our heads." Reynolds placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we've come too far to back down now. We need to stay focused and keep pushing forward." The chapter closed with Eleanor's resolve strengthened, despite the mounting challenges. The pursuit of truth had taken on a new dimension, where alliances were fragile and betrayals were imminent. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but Eleanor's determination remained unwavering. The city's skyline glowed faintly under the blanket of night, the buildings standing like silent sentinels over the bustling streets below. Eleanor Hayes sat alone in her dimly lit office, her desk strewn with documents, photographs, and notes. The quiet hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed her life over the past weeks. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on a particular photograph, a grainy image of a man standing near the scene of her mother's murder. The man's face was partially obscured, but his posture and the way he held himself were familiar. It was the same man from the new witness statements, the same man Robert Hale had been seen with. The door creaked open, and Reynolds stepped in, his face drawn with exhaustion but his eyes alight with determination. "I've been going over the new evidence," he said, dropping a folder onto the desk. "We need to talk." Eleanor looked up, her heart racing as she anticipated the weight of what Reynolds might reveal. "What have you found?" Reynolds flipped open the folder, revealing a series of documents and photos, each more damning than the last. "I found something significant. It's not just Hale we need to worry about. There's another player in this game, someone with a vested interest in keeping the truth buried." Eleanor's brow furrowed as she scanned the documents. There were records of financial transactions, covert meetings, and shadowy figures, evidence that pointed to a powerful figure who had been manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. "This is big," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the weight of the discovery. Who is this person? Reynolds pointed to a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in a suit. This is Jonathan Collins. He's a high-profile businessman with connections to organized crime. He's been involved in several shady deals, but nothing ever stuck. It looks like he's been pulling the strings. Eleanor's mind raced as she processed the information. Collins was not only influential but also dangerous. The realization that the case was entangled with such a powerful figure sent a shiver down her spine. The transition from suspect to a broader network of corruption was becoming clearer. The following day, Eleanor and Reynolds attended a high-profile charity gala hosted by Collins. The opulent venue was a stark contrast to the grim reality they were facing. The glittering chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests seemed like a facade, masking the dark underbelly of their investigation. As they mingled among the guests, Eleanor's eyes scanned the room for Collins. The gala was a showcase of wealth and power, and Collins was the centerpiece. He moved through the crowd with a charismatic ease, his every gesture calculated to impress. Eleanor and Reynolds positioned themselves strategically, observing Collins and his interactions. The gala was a tense dance of social niceties and hidden agendas, and Eleanor felt the weight of every smile and handshake. The transition from the high society event to the deeper implications of their investigation was palpable. As the evening wore on, Eleanor caught sight of Collins in a private conversation with an unidentified man. The exchange was hushed, and Collins' demeanor was guarded. Eleanor signaled Reynolds, and they discreetly moved closer, trying to catch every word. "We need to end this," Collins said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "Too many people are getting too close to the truth. We can't let it come out now." The man nodded, his face shadowed by the dim light. "What's the plan?" Collins' response was lost in the murmur of the crowd, but the implications were clear. Collins was actively working to suppress the investigation, and Eleanor now had concrete proof of his involvement. The turning point had arrived. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the realization of Collins' role in the conspiracy was both a victory and a new challenge. Eleanor's resolve hardened. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight for justice had become a battle against a powerful adversary. As Eleanor and Reynolds left the gala, the night air was crisp and filled with the promise of resolution. The transition from the deceptive glamour of the event to their focused determination was marked by a sense of urgency. The turning point had set the stage for a final confrontation, and Eleanor was more determined than ever to see the case through to its end. The chapter closed with Eleanor's unwavering commitment to unraveling the truth, no matter the cost. The fight for justice had become a personal mission, and the path forward was clear. Confront Collins, expose the corruption, and bring closure to the case that had haunted her for so long. The dawn broke with a gray, overcast sky, mirroring the heavy mood that hung over Eleanor Hayes and Detective Reynolds. Today was the day they had planned for, the day they would finally confront Jonathan Collins and attempt to bring justice to light. Eleanor's determination was palpable as they prepared for their final confrontation. They arrived at Collins' corporate headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper that loomed over the city like a fortress of power. The building's sleek glass facade reflected the overcast sky, creating an illusion of impenetrability. As they entered the lobby, the air was cool and sterile, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of office workers and the distant hum of elevators. Eleanor and Reynolds were escorted to a conference room on the top floor, where Collins was awaiting them. The room was expansive, with a panoramic view of the city stretching out below. Collins stood by the window, his back to them, as they entered. "Judge Hayes, Detective Reynolds," Collins greeted them, his voice smooth and composed. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Eleanor's eyes locked onto Collins as she took a seat across from him. "Mr. Collins, we have evidence linking you to a significant cover-up in the investigation of my mother's murder. We need to discuss your involvement and the extent of your actions." Collins turned slowly, his face a mask of calm. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. I have nothing to hide." Reynolds stepped forward, placing a series of documents and photographs on the table. "We have proof of your connections to Robert Hale, and other criminal activities that suggest you've been orchestrating a cover-up. Collins' demeanor shifted subtly, but his control remained apparent. These are serious accusations, Judge Hayes. I'm afraid you'll need more than documents to prove such claims. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice steady. We have more than just documents. We have testimonies, financial records, and evidence of your attempts to interfere with the investigation. It's only a matter of time before everything comes to light. The tension in the room was palpable. The transition from formal accusation to the raw intensity of the confrontation was almost tangible. Collins' calm facade began to crack, revealing a flicker of unease. You think you're so clever, Collins said, his voice rising slightly, but you're out of your depth. I have powerful connections, and I won't let you jeopardize everything I've worked for. Eleanor's heart raced, but she remained resolute. You've underestimated the resolve of this investigation. The truth will come out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. As Collins' frustration grew, he slammed his fist on the table. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't just about your mother's case. It's about a larger game you're not equipped to play. The confrontation reached its peak as Eleanor and Reynolds pressed on, challenging Collins' threats and exposing the layers of deception he had woven. Collins, cornered and desperate, attempted to deflect and discredit their evidence, but his efforts only highlighted his guilt. The door to the conference room suddenly opened, and a group of FBI agents entered, led by Victor, the informant who had tipped off Reynolds. The agents began to search the room, collecting documents and confiscating evidence. This is a federal investigation now, Victor announced, his voice firm. Mr. Collins, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Collins' expression was a mix of shock and rage as he was led away in handcuffs. The transition from the high-stakes confrontation to the arrest was swift, a testament to the coordinated effort that had brought them to this moment. Eleanor and Reynolds watched as Collins was escorted out of the building, a sense of victory and relief washing over them. The weight of their efforts had finally come to fruition, and the path to justice had been paved. As the agents continued their work, Eleanor and Reynolds took a moment to reflect. The confrontation had been intense and fraught with danger, but it had also marked a turning point in their quest for truth. The chapter closed with a sense of resolution and anticipation. The confrontation had been a decisive moment, setting the stage for the final unraveling of the mystery. Eleanor's journey was nearing its end, and the promise of justice was within reach. The air was crisp with the early morning chill as Eleanor Hayes stood outside the courthouse, the building's granite facade rising imposingly in front of her. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a soft light over the scene. Today was the day of Jonathan Collins' trial, a culmination of weeks of investigation, confrontation, and mounting tension. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The grand hallways, typically echoing with the routine bustle of legal proceedings, were now abuzz with reporters, legal professionals, and spectators. Eleanor walked through the crowded corridors, her thoughts a turbulent sea as she prepared for the trial ahead. Reynolds met her at the entrance to the courtroom, his face set in a determined expression. "We're ready," he said. "The evidence is solid, and Collins will have a hard time wriggling out of this one." Eleanor nodded, but a lingering sense of unease gnawed at her. She knew the trial would be a critical test, not only for the pursuit of justice but also for her own personal closure. The courtroom was a scene of tense formality. The judge, a stern figure presiding over the proceedings, took his seat. Collins entered, his demeanor a mask of defiance and arrogance. He glanced briefly at Eleanor, a flicker of recognition and disdain passing between them. The trial began with the prosecution presenting its case. The evidence was damning. Financial records, testimonies, and the detailed account of Collins' attempts to obstruct justice. Each piece of evidence was a step closer to unraveling the truth, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were higher than ever. As the prosecution laid out its case, Collins' defense team mounted a vigorous counterattack. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Eleanor's personal stake in the case made her a biased witness. The courtroom buzzed with the exchange of arguments and counter-arguments, the tension thickening with each passing moment. Eleanor took the stand to testify, her heart pounding as she faced the courtroom. Her testimony was clear and compelling, detailing her investigation and the connections she had uncovered. Yet, under cross-examination, Colin's attorney tried to discredit her, questioning her motives and scrutinizing every detail of her findings. Despite the challenges, Eleanor remained steadfast. She knew the truth was on her side, but the trial had taken a toll on her emotionally and mentally. The transition from the courtroom drama to her personal reflections was marked by a profound sense of exhaustion and determination. Outside the courthouse, as the day wore on, Eleanor and Reynolds found a quiet spot to catch their breath. The weight of the trial and its potential outcome hung heavy in the air. "We've done everything we can," Reynolds said, his voice tinged with concern. "But there's still a lot riding on the jury's verdict." Eleanor sighed, her gaze distant. "The price of truth is never cheap. No matter the outcome, this has cost us a lot, personally and professionally. But I have to believe it's worth it." As the trial drew to a close, the jury deliberated, and the courtroom waited in tense silence. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The transition from the trial's conclusion to the final verdict was a period of anxious anticipation. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Jonathan Collins was found guilty on multiple counts, including obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The sense of relief that swept through the courtroom was palpable, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the personal costs that had come with the pursuit of justice. As Eleanor walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the trial's resolution settled on her shoulders. The price of truth had been high, and the journey had been fraught with obstacles and sacrifices. Yet, there was a sense of accomplishment in knowing that justice had prevailed, even if it had come at a steep personal cost. The chapter closed with Eleanor's reflection on the journey she had undertaken. The pursuit of truth had exacted a toll, but it had also brought her closer to resolving the lingering shadows of her mother's case. As she looked out over the city, the promise of a new beginning and the possibility of finding peace lingered in the air. The city seemed to exhale a sigh of relief as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the skyline. Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of the park, her eyes following the gentle sway of the trees as they danced in the evening breeze. The park had become a sanctuary for her, a place of solace and reflection amidst the whirlwind of recent events. It had been a few weeks since Jonathan Collins' conviction, and the world had begun to shift back to a semblance of normalcy. The park's tranquility was a stark contrast to the intensity of the courtroom battles and the chaos of the investigation. Eleanor's thoughts wandered back to the pivotal moments of her journey, the confrontation, the trial, and the sacrifices made along the way. As she sat on a bench, Reynolds joined her, his face etched with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. "It's finally over," he said, settling beside her. "Collins is behind bars, and the case is officially closed." Eleanor nodded, her gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "It feels surreal, like waking up from a long, dark dream. But there's a sense of peace now, a quiet after the storm." The park's ambience provided a soothing backdrop as Eleanor and Reynolds reflected on the case's resolution. The transition from the turmoil of the trial to this moment of calm was a welcome relief, allowing them to process the weight of their journey. Reynolds turned to Eleanor, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What's next for you? Have you thought about what comes after all this?" Eleanor considered the question, her thoughts drifting to the future she had put on hold. "I think it's time for a new beginning. I need to find a way to move forward, to embrace the next chapter of my life." As they spoke, a familiar figure approached. Victor, the informant who had played a crucial role in their investigation. He carried a small envelope, his expression serious but hopeful. "Judge Hayes, Detective Reynolds," Victor said, extending the envelope to Eleanor. "I thought you might like to have this." Eleanor accepted the envelope, her curiosity piqued. Inside was a letter from a woman named Clara, an old friend of her mother's. Clara had been a silent witness to many of the events surrounding the murder and had held onto a piece of crucial information for years. The letter detailed Clara's memories and provided additional insights into the circumstances leading up to the murder. It was a poignant reminder of the personal connections and the human stories that lay beneath the surface of the investigation. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. The closure she had sought was not just in the courtroom, but also in the personal connections she had rekindled. The transition from the pursuit of justice to personal healing was complete. As dusk settled over the park, Eleanor and Reynolds walked together, the cool evening air a gentle reminder of the passage of time. The city lights began to twinkle, casting a soft glow on the path ahead. "I'm grateful for everything we've accomplished," Eleanor said, her voice filled with resolve. "But I'm also ready to embrace the future, to rebuild and find new purpose." Reynolds smiled, his support unwavering. "You've done an incredible job. Whatever comes next, I know you'll face it with the same strength and determination." The chapter closed with Eleanor's renewed sense of hope and purpose. The journey that had begun with a quest for justice had transformed into a path of personal renewal and growth. As she walked into the future, the promise of new beginnings and the opportunity to shape her own destiny lingered in the air. The park's serenity, the city's vibrant pulse, and the quiet strength within Eleanor marked the end of one chapter and the hopeful start of another. Click on the video being recommended to you now.